Greetings. This is the commentary and sermonette on the song Like a Tree. This was number 137. The date I have on this is July 9th, 1983. Old, which means it was one that was a partial I'd done earlier, and then at this date I completed it. And I think I want to read the passage that the first part of this comes from and then turn to the lyrics, because you'll see that I rearranged it some in order to fit the song. Thus saith the Lord, cursed is the man who trusts in mankind and makes flesh his strength, and whose heart turns away from the Lord. For he will be like a bush in the desert, and will not see when prosperity comes, but will live in stony wastes in the wilderness, a land of salt without inhabitant. Blessed is the man who trusts in the Lord, and whose trust is the Lord. For he will be like a tree planted by the water, that extends its roots by a stream, and will not fear when the heat comes, but its leaves will be green, and will not be anxious in a year of drought, nor cease to yield fruit. A similar passage to this we'll find in Psalms. How blessed is the man who does not walk in the counsel of the wicked, nor stand in the path of sinners, nor sit in the seat of scoffers. But his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law he meditates day and night. And he will be like a tree firmly planted by streams of water, which yields its fruit in its season, and its leaf does not wither, and whatever he does, he prospers. So it's a little bit of a takeoff from that. And as I was writing the intro to the song, as I posted it on YouTube, I made the comment that God often uses things in nature to convey to us some sort of a spiritual truth or a spiritual insight. For example, leaven, how it spreads through the whole loaf, like sin that will not just be one, it spreads through the entire person. Or sheep or lambs, Jesus being the Lamb of God, so it's a physical illustration of a defenseless or harmless animal, comparing that to the Christ. But a whole host of other things. For example, like he's the rock, and we build on the rock, versus sand, deserts or stony wastes equal living in the flesh, anti-God. So there's all kinds of examples. And this song is one where those who seek him are compared to a tree versus a thorn bush or briars. So having read the Jeremiah passage in that little piece out of Psalm 1, let me just read the lyrics now. Blessed is the man who trusts in the Lord, and whose trust is the Lord. For he will be like a tree planted by a stream very firmly. That really doesn't need a whole lot of explanation, I don't think. One who trusts in the Lord, and whose trust is the Lord. So to trust in him for our deliverance from sin, that might be pointing towards trusting him for these things we don't see yet or can't prove yet. But blessed is the man who trusts in the Lord, and those whose trust is the Lord. And maybe that would be more of a reference to going through some circumstance in life that our trust is indeed the Lord. Not what we can do to fix the situation, and not anybody's counsel to help us, but where he is our trust to get us through what we're dealing with. He will be like a tree planted by a stream very firmly. He will not fear when the heat comes, but his leaves will be green, still drawn from the sun. I throw that in there. S-U-N-S-O-N. He will not be anxious in a year of drought, nor cease to yield fruit. He won't become mute. I threw that in there too. So we continue to present the Lord. I've even thought of this lately. I'm not so sure that I want to be seen as representing him as much as presenting him. Because to represent God, we really need to be reflecting him as much as possible. That is a tall order, because he is holy and we are still in these earthen vessels. And like in James he was saying, let few among you become teachers, knowing that we shall incur a stricter judgment, for we all stumble in many ways. So I feel confident that I want to present the things of God, and even if I'm not doing it, that doesn't mean it isn't correct. It is correct. So I want to present his things. The goal is for me to also represent that more and more. This one who is trusting in the Lord will keep presenting God's will and God's ways. Because you see, he'll be like a tree planted by a stream. Oh, so very firmly. But cursed is the man. Here we go into a minor key, I guess it is. I really don't know music, so I think it's an A minor. But anyway, but cursed is the man who trusts in mankind, making the arm of the flesh his strength. He'll be found in a stony waste, living in the wilderness. See, that's another example, an arm of flesh, his strength. Not where you're literally hanging on some arm of flesh to be your strength, but the philosophy of man, the understandings of man that are contrary to the things of God. That person is cursed who trusts in mankind. If people truly understood they are mortal, they're going to die, and that every man is going to die. We study history, they've all died, these philosophers and all the rest of it, but people gloss over that as though they have some kind of answers to life when they've died. The whole point of Christianity is that Jesus did die, but he physically rose from the dead 3 days later. That is a stamp of his authority that makes his information worth listening to, that he has answers no one else has. So cursed is the man who trusts in mankind. Put your hopes and your priorities and your goals upon the things that any man has put forward, including yourself. Making the arm of flesh his strength, master of my own fate, all that stuff. He will be found in a stony waste, living in the wilderness. And now in the song, I break back to the positive, saying, but blessed is the man who trusts in the Lord, and whose trust is the Lord. For he will be like a tree, planted by a stream, so very firmly. And at this point, I break to the Isaiah passage. The Spirit of the Lord God is upon me. Remember, Jesus said this in Nazareth in the synagogue. Because the Lord has anointed me to bring good news to the afflicted. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to captives and freedom to prisoners, to proclaim the favorable year of the Lord and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn, to grant those who mourn in Zion, giving them a garland instead of ashes, the oil of gladness instead of mourning, the mantle of praise instead of a spirit of fainting. So they will be called oaks of righteousness, the planting of the Lord, that he may be glorified. So I take the last part of that, Isaiah 61:3, and I say about the one who trusts in the Lord and whose trust is the Lord, he will have the oil of gladness instead of mourning, the mantle of praise instead of a spirit of fainting. And they will be called oaks of righteousness, the planting of the Lord, that he might be glorified. Now I read that in Judea that there were several species of oaks, and some were prickly evergreen and some were deciduous. I've always thought of an oak tree more as a deciduous tree that loses its leaves every year and then has new growth that comes back. But in our neck of the woods, an oak is a hardwood, and in many new subdivisions, they'll want to get quick growth. So there's one tree in particular, a Bradford pear. It has white blooms on it in the spring, but the thing grows and branches out kind of at one point on the trunk. It has this weakness to where when some good winds come up as they get bigger, it'll break off parts of that Bradford pear, and then it just looks terrible. Well, an oak is a much sturdier tree. It's a hardwood. It grows slower, but it grows better, and it's much more sturdy. So I think this reference to oaks of righteousness is what will be called, would be that we grow with the growth which is from God. It's slow and steady, and it's solid to where when the storms of life come, it stands. If you look at my video, the very last of the video, there's a tree that I took a photo of in Lakewood Ranch, and it's all cockeyed, and yet it's still growing up and everything, and it's like, okay, we take some pretty serious blows in this life, but we still keep growing, and we still stay rooted, and we don't get knocked over. So that's kind of what that next to the last photo is that I use in the video that goes with the song. Now, concerning this slow growth and the hardness, I love this passage here that I want to read. God was talking to Ezekiel, and I've asked if the Lord would apply this to me, if he would. Then he said to me, Son of man, go to the house of Israel and speak with my words to them. You are not being sent to a people of unintelligible speech or difficult language, but to the house of Israel, your native tongue to native tongues. Nor to many peoples of unintelligible speech or difficult language, whose words you cannot understand, but I have sent you to them who should listen to you. Yet the house of Israel will not be willing to listen to you, since they are not willing to listen to me. Now, that part I, of course, haven't asked if the Lord would do. Surely the whole house of Israel is stubborn and obstinate. Behold, I have made your face as hard as their faces, and your forehead as hard as their foreheads. Like emery, harder than flint, I have made your forehead. Do not be afraid of them or be dismayed before them, though they are a rebellious house. Moreover, he said to me, Son of man, take into your heart all the words which I shall speak to you, and listen closely. Go to the exiles, to the sons of your people, and speak to them. Tell them whether they listen or not. Thus saith the Lord. Now, the way I've phrased it is, Lord, I want to be as hard in righteousness as they are in wickedness. I want to actually be harder in righteousness than they are in evil. And only God can change us to be that way, because I was over here before. He says our minds were alienated from God, hostile to God, and we were enemies to God. That's where we all start. That's where we all are in our natural person. Now, when we become a Christian, he talks about the renewing of the spirit of your mind. The mind is the battleground. Repentance is change of mind. That will then affect your behaviors. But the battle is the mind and information. And God says his thoughts are not our thoughts. And there's a clash that happens. I call it a lot of times God going clockwise and I'm going counterclockwise. And when the two hit, which one's going to win? Well, God's going to win every time. But you are going to be butting heads with God. And that's why I said a little earlier, I want to present him. It doesn't really mean that all the time that I'm representing him, because sometimes we are still hostile to God and we don't want to believe what he has to say about matters. We still want to hold to our own view and opinions, because many times he says there is a way that seems right to a man, but the end thereof is the way of death. But it seems right. So God challenges that, and the key is to be willing to be persuaded by him that he is indeed correct, and then yield. When we do that, he'll then give us more information to actually bolster that surrender or that yielding to him that we have done. He'll give us more information to where we know that indeed he is right in everything, every position he takes. He says there's no wisdom, there's no understanding, there's no counsel against the Lord, none that's going to prevail. So the house of Israel was stubborn and obstinate, and they rejected the cornerstone, the chief cornerstone, framed and executed at the hands of the Romans. So that part of Ezekiel, I want to leave to Ezekiel and what he was dealing with. Because what we are told is that the Son was not sent into the world in order to condemn or damn the world. It's already damned, but in order that it might be saved. So my hope is our hardness in righteousness. It's not to prove that we're right. It's not to intimidate, and it's not to lord that over anybody. But we stand for what is correct. You let the Lord back that up. Am I just going to be adding more condemnation to them by them rejecting what I share with them? Or is God going to use that as one breadcrumb in this penetration of a sin grid to cause this person to go from death into life? That's my whole confidence in why we are here and how the Lord intends on using us. So that gives me great confidence to share the things of God with my own native tongue and let the Lord show up. I told a young fellow last week, and I knew he was young in the faith, and one thing I said, and he liked this, I said, when we share with people, I don't want to be putting any pressure on somebody. I want the Lord to put pressure on them. And he said, yeah, I like that. I said, yeah. I said, because it's not our job to open people's eyes. It's not our job to bring people from death into life. We can't do these things. It's not our job to make someone grow. Like Paul said, I planted and Apollos watered, but God causes the growth. So whether it's turning to the Lord and being delivered from sins, which we call salvation, or growing in the Lord, it's still all God that is doing that. So he used us in that process, but that's the point. He uses us, and he's the one behind it, because he's the one of the power of his word. He's the one that brings it home, so to speak. So that's why I don't want to put any pressure on anybody, because I don't need to. It's not my position. It's to present his claims as best I can and whatever opportunities I'm granted, and let the Lord then do his thing. To where I said to this young fellow, I'll be talking with somebody, but I'm actually looking past that person, looking to the Lord to actually make it take. There's tremendous freedom in that. It gives you tremendous freedom to share, to do it in a lot of peace and with a lot of joy, because you have great confidence that the Lord himself is interested in that individual getting right with him, because that's why he came. I've asked the Father to honor the work of his Son, because you alone are the only one who knows what Jesus went through, not just on the cross, but the whole obedience to the point of the cross, where he knew these things he was doing and saying was going to lead him to a Roman cross. And he was a man just as much as he was God. And he did not want to go through that horrendous experience, and especially then being turned into sin on the cross. Only God the Father knows what the Son did. And the sole purpose was so that sinners, me, you, and whoever we can touch, might be given pardon for our transgressions and be transferred from the domain and the authority of darkness into the kingdom of the beloved Son, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of our sins. So that's been my request from the Lord. And one example of that, I was just a very young Christian. I was on staff at a drug rehab, and I could tell you a lot of stories, but I had this old 64 Newport Chrysler. It was black, push-button transmission, and I was getting right at the end of my time to be at Turning Point, and I had just become exhausted there. A lot of things had happened. But those last 2 weeks I was there, I was just ready to get out and get on to my next chapter. And this old couple showed up. They were in an RV, but he'd be walking around with a little bucket of tools, tinkering with this and tinkering with that and tinkering with the other, fixing stuff. Well, somehow or another, he decided to do something to my car. When I found out he'd done some work on my car, I went out there and it didn't start. Well, that just flew all over me. And I was already thinking, this old codger putting around here. I mean, being Mr. Sweet, nice guy and his wife. Everything in me, I just didn't want anything to do with this guy. And especially then when he screwed my car up. And I got really mad. Well, anyway, so he got the car fixed again, and so they're ready to move on because they were in an RV and they were just, I think, going to different places like Turning Point and seeing what they could do to help, I guess. So anyway, the morning he's going to leave, is like, man, I'm glad he's getting out of here, both of them. And I heard all this racket outside the window, and I looked out there, and Florida is basically a sandbar, and his RV was stuck in the sand, and the tire was spinning, and I said, sir, that old guy, right? And then I thought, what am I doing? What am I thinking? I'm never going to see this guy again. Robin, get down there and help him. So I went down there and put some plywood under, did whatever, and got him up and got him out of the sand. So they're getting ready to go then. And I said, sir, I'd like to talk to you for just a minute. And so I confessed to him. I just told him what my feelings were and what I was thinking and all that, and I apologized. And he just said, look, he said, don't worry about it. He said, it's not a problem. I don't think he was even aware of it. It's more inside of me than external, I think. But then he said, I prayed that the Lord would give me a thick skin, but a soft heart. And I thought, man, isn't that it? To have a thick skin where you don't react to abuses and accusations as much as possible, these arrows. A thick skin, but a soft heart. Isn't that the goal? We want our forehead as hard as their forehead, like emery, harder than flint in righteousness, yet a very big heart welcoming heart, soft heart, a gentleness. I know you can have both. And that's what I've asked the Lord to grow me into. Paul said, I think it's Corinthians, sometimes I was like a nursing mother with you. Think about a nursing mother. That's close in, talking gently. Other times, like a disciplining father. It's whatever you needed. Sometimes you needed discipline. Sometimes you needed nursing and comfort. Paul was thick-skinned, but a big heart. And I said to the Lord, as a young Christian, I don't know how to get there. I can't get me there, but I know you can. And I ask that you would, because that's how I want to be. Paul didn't compromise at all on the truth. In fact, one of his letters, he even said, the criticism is when I'm among you, I'm just this little blob of gentleness and whatever. Then when I'm away from you, I write these harsh, sharp letters. What do you want me to be when I'm with you? I can come in wielding the sword and cutting you to pieces and leaving you there bleeding. But he came according to their need at the time, event by event by event. That's what we need to be doing too. They will be called oaks of righteousness, hard wood, the planting of the Lord, that he might be glorified. And that's where I get into the minor again. But cursed is the man who trusts in mankind. And then I throw all this in here. Trapped in the darkness, behind iron bars, made to drink water from poisoned jars. He'll be dwelling in a land of salt, in a desert waste. So those are just illustrations of one that is trusting in mankind. They're trapped in darkness. Jesus says the one that sins, the same is the slave of sin. And darkness is one of those illustrations for sin or being in sin. Behind iron bars, he says with Israel, he'll turn them over to the power or the hand of their transgressions. And he talks about us being prisoners, made to drink water from poisoned jars. The water that's being consumed is poisonous. As a Christian, we're to have streams of living water. Living water would be fresh water that's moving. The water of sin is dead water, trapped water, stagnant water in poisoned jars. He calls us vessels of clay, and the potter can make one vessel for honorable use and another for dishonorable. So the dishonorable one has stagnant water in it, and what they would pour out that people would be drinking is just death, and it makes it where you'll be dwelling in a land of salt in a desert waste. But blessed is the man who trusts in the Lord and whose trust is the Lord. For he will be like a tree planted by a stream very firmly. Now this comes from Isaiah. Instead of the thorn bush, the cypress will come up. Instead of briars, the myrtle will grow. Transformed deserts, honor from shame, beauty from ashes, in the Lord's name. Indeed, he will be like a tree, planted, oh, so very firmly. As far as a cypress tree, instead of a thorn bush, there was a couple of varieties. They were evergreen, and some would be as much as 60 feet tall, just majestic trees. We have cedar trees here in Kentucky. Some of them are just tremendously big and just very majestic evergreens. But the myrtle, I read that these branches is what they would use for the Feast of the Tabernacles, booths that were made out of the branches from the myrtle. So instead of briars or nettles, the myrtle comes up. Instead of thorn bush, cypress comes up. Again, a life that's spent in the flesh or the natural man, it's thorn bushes and it's briars. You can think of some people, I can think of a bunch of people, that to try to touch them, you're going to get stuck with thorns. It's like a thorn bush. You want to try to hug a thorn bush, can't do it without injury. There's many people that are so aggressive and thorny and so hostile that you can't even be around them without injury. And he says instead of that, you're going to have cypresses come up and myrtles. And so I close this song with Isaiah 55. I'll lift a little bit out of there. You will go out with joy and be led forth with peace. And the mountains and hills will break forth into shouts of joy before you. And all the trees of the field will clap their hands. Instead of the thorn bush, the cypress will come up. And instead of the nettle or briar, the myrtle will come up. and it will be a memorial to the Lord for an everlasting sign which will not be cut off. So that's why in the last part of this song, I say, indeed, he will be like a tree planted oh so very firmly, an eternal memorial or an eternal sign. It's like this tree that he makes us into is a marker that is going to be seen for eternity. That's who you are. That's who we are. It's incredible what God does in terms of committing himself to us and that we're going to live forever. And it's for the Lord's renown. We're giving thanks to him and credit to him for this remake of us from death into life, from a thorn bush to a cypress, to be an oak of righteousness. And it's a memorial for his renown of his power and his grace. And this tree will never be cut down. He will be like a tree planted very firmly. Yes, he'll be like a tree planted by a stream, so very firmly. We need to be by that stream and drawing living water. We grow steadily and we grow as a hardwood, and even in a year of drought, we don't cease to yield fruit. Well, I want to thank you for listening, and like I always say, listen to this material, and you're going to learn great and mighty things that you have not known. And when you listen to this material and learn from it, it only leads to one place, life, and you will indeed live.